You, Julie. It's great to be back. It's a real pleasure doing a bunch of teaching for my Jewish learning last year, and then I've had a bit of a hiatus for a couple of months. Tomorrow, my baby will turn 12 weeks. So in the last few months, I haven't really been doing a whole lot of teaching of this form. It's great to be getting back to it and to see some familiar faces from some of the teaching last year and some new faces too. Let's jump right into it. Time is short and the task is great. This week, tomorrow, we're reading Parashat Vayetzei, which is a thrilling tale of, I'm not going to swear to this, but this might be the most elaborately developed relationship, interpersonal relationship in the Torah, the relationship between Yaakov, Jacob, our ancestor, and Lavan, his father-in-law. If not, it's up there. It's a very subtle and rich literary legacy, most of which happens in this week's Parsha, a little bit of which happened a couple of weeks ago. So I want to jump in and evaluate the nature of Yaakov and Lavan's relationship. Lavan appears in the story as a pretty bad dude, as a conniver, a swindler. Of course, Yaakov does as well, but seems to struggle to break out of that. And there are certain ways in which his trials with Lavan are maybe a comeuppance for his own swindling of Esav. It's a strong reading that way of his twin brother. Be that as it may, Lavan in the actual stories of the Torah does not appear as a very sympathetic character, and the conclusion of his appearance in the story is negative. However, his negative legacy gets jacked up in the rabbinic imagination to really surprising proportions. So I want to start with that, with one of the most famous passages in Jewish liturgy that is about Lavan. And then we'll kind of go back and revisit many of the texts that depict Lavan in the Torah, reading with an eye toward understanding what was the deal with him. So I'm going to share my screen. Julie hopefully has put the link, just put the link to the sheet in the chat so you can access it that way as well if you prefer. Share screen. Okay. So we're calling this Lavan sought to uproot everything. Let's start with Laban, if you will, in the rabbinic imagination. It's an arch enemy. You'll recall toward the end of the book of Deuteronomy, Parashat Kitavo, there's a mitzvah, a commandment, really unrelated to our issues today, that every Israelite, once landed and prosperous, has to bring the first fruits of their harvest as an offering to God. It's a way of reminding us that we don't really own what we have, that rich people should not tell themselves the totally ridiculous ideology that we are responsible for our own wealth or we deserve it somehow. And so the very first fruit, instead of bragging about it, everyone brings it to the temple and makes the same declaration, which is a kind of mythic retelling of Israelite history and our origins in poverty until and dependency until God redeemed us. So that statement starts what everyone says when they're first processing the indication of their own prosperity. They declare, "A perishing Aramean was my father." We'll skip the next line for a second. I'll explain why. "A perishing Aramean was my father, and he went down to Egypt and resided there with a few people. And there he became a nation, large, vast, and numerous." In Hebrew, that first line is Arami Oved Avi. There's actually quite a dispute among early, middle, and late commentators around what that somewhat ambiguous Hebrew phrase means. The word Oved in Hebrew, the root means eliminate, destroy, perish, something in that semantic range. It can be an adjective modifying Arami, so that my father, Avi, was an Arami Oved, was a perishing Aramean or a wandering Aramean. Or oved could be a transitive verb. In Aramean, was ovading my father. And Aramean was in the process of destroying my father. Grammatically, the first one seems more likely. Oved, that, without getting into the details, it's a little bit unusual in biblical Hebrew to see a transitive verb in that form, more common in Aramaic. But it's possible. But the downside to reading it as my father was a perishing Aramean is that it's weird to describe my father as an Aramean. Only one character in the Tanakh is ever described as an Aramean, and that's Lavan. And so that gives birth to the other reading. So the so-called pshat reading, probably the most likely contextual reading, the way most translations render it, is my father was a wandering or perishing Aramean. And the idea would be my ancestor, probably Jacob, maybe Abraham, but probably Yaakov, was impoverished and rudderless, directionless. When that's referring to is an interesting question. And then went down to Egypt, resided there, a few people, blah, 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 blah. The story of Yaakov and where we came from. Onkelos' Aramaic translation, as well as the most common rabbinic interpretation that also makes its way into the Haggadah, reads it as the Arami, the only person in the Tanakh described as the Aramean, Lavan ha'Arami, was in the process of destroying my father. And then he went down to Egypt, resided there. A problem with that is, what in the world does Lavan have to do with Yaakov going down to Egypt? There are many years that transpire between Yaakov's departure from Lavan's house and going down to Egypt. Remember, he leaves Lavan's house right after Joseph is born, after Joseph is born. Joseph gets thrown in the pit by his brothers when he's 17, so that's 17 years at least. And then he's 30, Joseph's 30 when he gets into Pharaoh's house, and 32 when Jacob's sons first go down to Egypt. So we're talking about 32 years between Yaakov leaving Lavan's house and going down to Egypt. They seem like really disconnected events. So that is a downside of interpreting it this way, but that is the way that the tradition has carried it. As we'll see in this Midrash, the classic early 3rd century Midrash L'Sifrei on the book of Deuteronomy, Arami Oved Avi, this teaches that Yaakov went down to Aram, to Lavan's house, to perish. Yarad Yaakov la'Aram ela le'Abeid. Lo yarad Yaakov la'Aram ela le'Abeid. It was, even though he was going there to save his life when his brother Esau wanted to kill him, it was a death trap in some way to go to Lavan's house. And it regards Lavan the Aramean as if he had destroyed him. Ki'ilu ibdo. This idea gets jacked up even more in the Pesach Haggadah, that long section of the traditional Haggadah when we pick apart each word and phrase of this passage in Deuteronomy to explicate and investigate our Exodus narrative. Go out and learn, say Lamad, what Lavan the Aramean sought to do to Yaakov our father. For Pharaoh decreed only on the males, but Lavan sought to uproot everything. As it is said, and Aramean was destroying my father, and he went down to Egypt and resided there with a few people, and there he became a nation large, vast, and numerous. So even if we read the story of Lavan and Yaakov and see, Lavan exploits him and cheats him and says, yes, you can marry my daughter Rachel, but then makes him work an extra 7 years and married Leah, who he wasn't interested in. And even if you say that Lavan's a bad dude, it's really fighting words in a quite surprising way to say that Lavan was worse than Pharaoh. Pharaoh decreed only on the males, the decree to throw all baby Israelite boys, Hebrew boys, into the river. Lavan sought to uproot everything. What does it mean Lavan sought to uproot everything? Sure didn't seem like Lavan was trying to kill his grandchildren. So what does that mean Lavan was uprooting everything? So that's what I want to pause on. I'll stop the screen share, and we can take a few minutes of suggestions questions, ideas, and then we'll move into reading a lot of the texts themselves. I see Esther Westelman has a hand up, so why don't you unmute yourself and go ahead.
Okay, I see a strong connection between the two stories of Haran and Mitzrayim, because in Hebrew, the letter Le means two, or the letter H at the end means good. In this parasha, it says Harana, and in the Egypt, it said Mitzrayima. So two Haran and two Mitzrayim. And in both cases, there is the H part of the name of God in the word. So there is, when you take a trip, you do it because of you or because God is with you. So the trip to Haran involves God. Sometimes we plan, we think we go for one reason and it's another, it's God's interference. And the same thing with Mitzrayim, Mitzrayima.
Thank you, Esther. I see a comment in the chat from Bimaya that had his deceit worked, there would have been no marriage. Do you want to unmute yourself and say a little more about that?
Sorry, just Bimaya.
I see Bimaya has added a little more. It says, Lavan and the switching the daughters. We would not have evolved according to plan. Meaning, had Yaakov married Rachel first, then everything we wouldn't exist as a people. So,
well, I mean, so I guess, I'm sorry, I was having a little trouble unmuting. What I was trying to say, like, had he switched out the daughters and then it was like, oh, well, that's the one that you get, it would have, I see what they mean, like uprooted the whole plan. It would have been worse because then we wouldn't have all the descendants that ended up to be the 12 tribes.
got it. So Lavan, so then it's the opposite. So Lavan helped us. And that's not uprooting everything. It's because Lavan did the switcheroo. Therefore, we have this robust people. Otherwise, Yaakov never would have married Leah, and we wouldn't have most of the tribes. So,
well, I mean, that's actually
thanks,
true when you think about it like that. But I see how they thought about it like as a negative in a way, just because of his deceit. Like, what if he hadn't like tried to work the additional 7 years to get the wife that he actually wanted? I thought that that's how they meant it.
Okay, I'm having trouble seeing the negative there, but
no, I agree. I agree.
Okay,
but I just figured that was the thought.
What I will share is that on the line of what you're saying, Mimia, there's a Rav named Avraham Bach. I actually don't know anything about him. I saw this passage of his quoted in a collection called Iturei Torah that collects kind of early modern and modern thinkers, like in little snippets of things wrote. So I don't know who this Rav Avraham Bach was, but he makes a connection saying Lavan messed with Yaakov's family dynamics and sowing distrust. So had Yaakov married Rachel first, then Yosef would have indeed been the eldest child, and nobody would have questioned the favorable treatment, which would have been in line with tradition and what later became the law. And it wouldn't have elicited all that jealousy. The jealousy was that all these older brothers felt like they got shafted for this little, this much younger brother who got favorably treated. So had Lavan not messed with that dynamic and sowing distrust, this sort of assumes that Yaakov would have ended up marrying them both and having all the kids as they exist, which is a little hard to wrap your head around. But in that way, Lavan's attack on Yaakov did lead to the descent to Egypt because it sowed the distrust that sowed that plan. I see there was another comment by Tanya says, doesn't Lavan mean white? Yeah, and that actually comes up. We see there are a lot of plays on words. Rachel means a ewe, like a female sheep, and Lavan kind of treats all the people in his household as property, as livestock. And we see, and there's also a play on words with the root for giving water to, by Yishak, and the word for to kiss, also Vayishak, just with a dot and a yud. And so when Rachel waters the sheep, she herself is a sheep, Rachel, and then when Yaakov kisses her, is he kissing her or watering her? There's like a lot of plays on words, and one of them we see that later on, Yaakov does a kind of insider trading kind of move to manipulate the fertility of the flocks and leaves the white ones to Lavan, etc. So there's a play on that too, and it's worth thinking about what that's about. Let's see, maybe one more question. Karen says Lavan was trying to keep Jacob a prisoner and he had to leave to found the Jewish nation. Great. So we're going to kind of explore what that is, what that's all about. Cecile says intentions of deceptions in the family. That is, intentions of Lavan are worse than clear hatred expressed by someone outside of the family, that is Pharaoh. So yes, Lavan is worse than Pharaoh. Cecile, you want to unmute yourself and say a little more? That's a provocative statement you're making, that intentions are worse. What do you mean? Why is deception worse than clear hatred?
Is this Cecile Kowalski or Cecile Sly?
It was Cecile Sly.
Unmute. Yes, so we have to trust those people that are in our families. And when that trust is broken, that's far more severe than any attacks that come from the outside. So in this case, if you can't believe those people you should be able to believe in, the harm is personally huge.
Right. Think of, I mean, the difference in what the trauma is. If you get abused, God forbid, or beaten in some way by somebody who you clearly see as obviously an outsider, an enemy, like, I don't know, the police or somebody, versus if your clergy, your pastor, your uncle, your parent, your sibling, somebody close to whom you're supposed to trust, if that person does the abuse, the degree of scarring can in certain ways be even more profound. So let's pause the comments and questions there and go back into the text, and kind of we're mostly going to stick with the biblical text in Breshit in our parsha henceforth, and try to unpack what's really at stake here in this relationship. That's the wrong document. Second. Okay. Go back to the screen share. Okay. So to understand what Lavan did that was so wrong, how he tried to uproot the entire thing, language in rabbinic, that in rabbinic language that usually is language associated with killing people, and it definitely doesn't seem, I mean, there's no real indication that Lavan tried to kill anybody. So it's a surprising statement. So let's start with 2 weeks ago, Parashat Vayetzei, Breshit, Genesis chapter 24. This is, in the context here, Abraham's servant, who we see named in another passage as Eliezer, but in that passage he's just called Eved Avraham, the servant of Abraham, has gone back to Abraham's family to find a wife for Abraham's son, Yitzchak. Lavan is the grandson of Abraham's brother Nahor. So after it happened, the servant of Abraham says, okay, here's a well. If any woman is generous, shows compassion and generosity, and offers to give me water, but also water the camels, then I'll know that this is a person who is appropriate, a person who is animated by kindness and generosity. So that happens, and Rivka comes out and does exactly that. And Avram's servant is excited, and he tells her who he is. Come from Abraham, who's your great uncle, etc. So the girl ran and told her mother's household all of this. Now Rivka had a brother whose name was Lavan. Lavan ran out to the man, to the spring. When he saw the nose ring and the bands on his sister's arms, because Avram's servant had given her this jewelry as an appreciation for her generosity. But when he saw the nose ring and the bands on her arms, and when he heard his sister's words saying, "Thus the man spoke to me," etc., with the marriage proposal and everything, then Lavan came up to the man who was still standing over the camels at the spring and said, "Come in, O blessed one of Adonai. Why should you remain outside? I've cleared the house out and a place for the camels." So the man entered the house, the camels were unloaded, the camels were given straw and feed, and water was brought to bathe his feet and the feet of the men with him. Now there's one way of reading this that sounds like, well, that's pretty good. Lavan, we see where Rivka's tradition of hospitality seems to be consistent in her family. Lavan is rolling out the red carpet for a big entourage. But the text cues us in saying, what was it that triggered Lavan's enthusiasm and generosity when he saw the nose ring and the bands on his sister's arms? That's when he demonstrated this generosity. Rashi, whereas Rivka had offered the generosity before without being offered any gifts, just saw a thirsty man with thirsty camels. Rashi picks up on that and notes on that passage, Lavan ran. So to what did he run and for what did he run? What was he running for? Limaratz ve'al maratz. When he saw the nose ring, he said, "This must be a rich man." And he had his eyes on his money. He was excited about this because this was an opportunity to absorb the wealth of Eved Avraham. When you think about then the continuation of that story, there's this weird dynamic as the story goes on, if you remember from 2 weeks ago, where the servant tells the whole shebang, and Laban's like, "Well, yeah, I guess this came from God. Sure, I guess we can't get in the way of this shidduch, but why don't you stay a little longer?" And Rivka's like, "No, I think I want to go right now." You get a sense that she really is animated by generosity and understands that there's a tendency in her household to try to suck people in and possess them. That Lavan was seeing an opportunity to absorb Abraham's family's wealth, whereas the proposal was actually for a relationship that would mean that his sister left the home. Lavan wants to absorb and control. Once he found out that he wasn't going to continue to control this wealth, he was less interested and just said more blandly, "Well, seems like this is from God, so what can we do? It's an omen." He didn't seem moved by Rivka's generosity itself. And Nechama Leibowitz actually notes in her commentary that Avram's servant actually edits when he retells Lavan what happened. He kind of edits a little bit and says, instead of saying that Rivka first gave me water, and then once I was like replenished, then she offered to the camels, he just cuts it short and is like, just as I had said in my vow and my prayer to God, that's what she did and fed us both. As though to say, Avram's servant maybe observed the way Lavan was eyeing all the wealth and picked up on the fact that an omen would speak to him, generosity was not going to speak to him. And so he kind of edits himself. The Nechama Leibowitz is a very subtle reading of that. So let's move on to the next times we meet Lavan. I'll share screen again. Second time we meet him, here we're now finally in our Parsha this week. So Yitzchak's son Yaakov, Yitzchak and Rivka. So this is Lavan's nephew Yaakov. Has fled home. I mean, he swindled his twin brother Esav, and Esav wants to kill him. So Rivka's like, "Why don't you go run and take refuge for a little while at my brother's place? I'll come and get you." Lavan just leaves with his staff. He's like totally by himself. Staff in hand, he takes refuge in Lavan's home to wait out his brother's rage. Similar story, he, comes to this well and he's thirsty, he does a feat of strength and rolls the stone. He tells Rachel who he is. I'm your Aunt Rivka's son. I'm your father's kinsman. She ran and told her father, which was Lavan. Again, by the way, it's odd that her name is Rachel, which means sheep. She's a shepherd. How does Lavan, who named her, view her in relation to, like, is she about her profitability to the family? She's about her work is with the sheep, maybe. I've seen some people, by the way, some scholars note that there might be an etymological connection between the name Leah and the Akkadian word for cow, which I believe is litu. I'm not sure whether biblical grammarians, like how biblical grammarians fall on that, but some scholars have suggested that might be an etymological connection, a hint that Lavan is naming all his kids livestock names. Another piece of circumstantial evidence that might support that is when the Torah idiomatically describes Leah as not good looking, as opposed to Rachel, who was beautiful. It describes Leah as having a naim rachot. Literally, that means like thin eyes or thin on the eye or something like that. That word rach has been used earlier in Breshit when Avraham serves some lean meat, bakar rach. And so if the name Leah is suggesting like a word for a cow, which is how Lavan sees his children as property and livestock, it's using a sort of crass imagery to say that like she wasn't attractive, she was like a weakly cow or something like that. Very crass. So I think we can say with more confidence that is going on literarily with the name Rachel. I'm less confident about the name Leah, but I wanted to share that. Be that as it may, Rachel goes and runs and tells her father. And then when Lavan heard the report of his sister's son, Yaakov, he ran toward him. Now notice here, he runs without seeing anything. As soon as he hears someone from Avram's house is here, he runs toward him, embraces him, kisses him, brings him into the house. When he recounted to Lavan all these things, what are all these things? Yaakov told the whole story. I guess my brother wanted to kill me, so I ran. And here I am as a refugee. Presumably that's all these things. Lavan said to him, "Indeed, you are my bone and flesh." When he had stayed with him a month's time, Lavan said to Yaakov, "Just because you are my kin, should you serve me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." Now let's really unpack those 2 verses. 3 verses. Rashi picks up on the similarity of Lavan running to greet the 2 guests, greeting Abraham's servant upon seeing the jewelry, and here just running in general. So why does he run this time? Rashi picks up, he's reasoning that he was laden with money for the servant of that household to come with 10 laden camels. Rachel comes in and says, somebody from Avram's house is here. Avram's grandson is here. Well, last time Lavan had any indication of Avram's house, he saw that Avram's house was loaded, and he saw an opportunity to swallow some of that wealth into his own estate, and then it escaped him. So here he runs to Yaakov, seeing an opportunity, and then there's no camels there. It's just a man and his walking stick. And when he tells him the whole story, which has to include basically he's a refugee, Lavan says to him, "Indeed, you are my bone and my flesh." Now, what is the impact of that statement? The word ach, translated here as indeed, usually is actually a contrast word, like however, or or by contrast. And so it's as though we're seeing a thought process that Lavan is going through, like, oh, I'm so excited. Let's absorb this rich man and his rich man property into our situation. And then he goes out and sees, oh, maybe tattered clothes, just a walking stick. He's processing everything. If we were staging this, we would see him kind of lose his zest and say, like he's now thinking out loud, sharing the second half of his thought. His first half is like, oh my God, you have nothing. You're a pauper. What a waste. However, you are my flesh and bone. So come on in. Like, what can I do? I think the rabbinic interpretation, picking up on these literary cues, would say that statement is a statement of resignation. I guess I have to bring you in. I can't turn you away. And then, as Rashi explains, now I have no reason to scoop you up into my house since you have nothing in your hands. But because we're relatives, I'll take care of you for a month's time. And so he did, but even this was not for nothing, for he tended his sheep. We find that out in verse 15. When he'd stayed with him for a month's time, Lavan said to him, well, you're going to work for nothing? Oh, so I guess for that whole month, Yaakov's been working. So as soon as he stayed, he's like, all right, well, you can stay here, but we take the sheep out just before dawn, and here's your group, and here's how you'll work. And he does that. And after a month, he's like, okay, let's work out a wage. So he squeezed a month of free labor out of him. Jumping forward, there's a lot that happens in the interim, most notably like his most famous act of trickery, Yaakov and Rachel love each other. Yaakov asks if he can marry Rachel, and Lavan says, yeah, work for 7 years and you can marry her. And then on the wedding night, oops, it's Leah. And he's like, well, it's okay, you can marry Rachel too, just 7 more years. And Lavan plays Yaakov too, knowing his sensitive points, knowing the ways in which he can taunt his vulnerability and exploit it by saying, in our place, it's not the custom for the younger child to precede the elder child. Knowing that had been Yaakov's crime. Yaakov had tried to jump the line with Esav, both in the womb, trying to come out first, but also, most notably, swindling Esav out of his birthright and blessing. Lavan knows about that, and he's playing on Yaakov. Well, in our place, we are righteous here. We would never upend the natural order of things. Be that as it may, finally, so years and years later, we get some indication after the fact of what these years were like. So it happened when Rachel bore Yosef. So that's his 11th son, 12th child, first child from Rachel. Yaakov said to Lavan, send me off so I may go to my own place, my own land. You sort of wonder, why doesn't he just go? That language of shalcheni, send me off, will be echoed later on in the 5th chapter of Shemot in Exodus, when Moshe and Aaron have their first meeting with Pharaoh and say, Ko amar Adonai Elohei Yisrael, this is what God says, send my people off. Shalach et ami, same word, shalach. Let my people go. And the language that Yaakov is using is let me go, shalcheni. Yaakov doesn't have freedom of movement, really. And I think we get to see why when we get an understanding of property and the culture of ownership. Yaakov was offered a wage at the beginning, but let's actually see what that really looked like economically. So Yaakov says, give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, that I may go. For you know the service that I have served. You know how this language of avodah, it's the same language used in Egypt. There isn't a different word in Hebrew for serve and servant and slave, but that's, you know what I've done. Why does Yaakov think after all this time that he needs Lavan's permission to move with his own children? Lavan said to him, if pray, I have found favor in your eyes, I've prospered, and Adonai has blessed me on your account. It opens up with this very friendly, beseeching language. It's similar to when union busting corporations today will open up with flowery language about, well, you know, we're a family here at Amazon or your NGO or whatever your organization is. We're a family here. Why don't we talk and work things out? And then you get to the substance of how power plays out. Name me your wages, I'll give you. Yaakov has a problem just saying what his wages are. He says, well, you know how I've served you, how your livestock has fared with me. For the little before me has swollen to plenty. I've made you rich. Just like the workers always make all CEOs rich. Since Adonai has blessed me wherever I turn. Now, it's time to provide for my household. In other words, everything Yaakov did so far has not been for his household, but for Lavan. So Lavan said, what shall I pay you? Yaakov says, pay me nothing, but do this thing. Let me go back and herd your flocks and watch them. I'll pass through your whole flock today, removing from there every speckled and spotted animal, every dark-colored sheep, every spotted and speckled goat, and that shall be my wages. Then my honesty will bear witness for me in the future when you go over my wages. If there are among my goats any that are not speckled or spotted, or any sheep that are not dark-colored, they can be considered stolen by me. Lavan says, very well, let it be as you say. Now, we might wonder for a second, geez, what is Yaakov making this so complicated for? Lavan told him, name your wages. I'll pay you. What should I pay you? And Yaakov insists on making it this complicated thing. I'm going to go back and take, so that all the sheep, there aren't that many sheep that are dark-colored or many goats that are spotted or speckled, but he somehow wants that minority, which will be recognizable. In other words, I don't want any confusion. I want everybody to know this is my property and not yours. As though he knows that Lavan is always going to find some way to game him. And indeed, we see in the very next verse, even though Yaakov has set up what appears to be an unfavorable arrangement for himself, because they're just biologically, there aren't that many dark sheep or spotted and speckled goats, that very same day after Lavan agrees to this, Lavan goes and removes all the streaked and spotted he-goats and everyone that had Lavan, white on it, and all the dark-colored sheep, and gave them over to his sons. Lavan races home before Yaakov can take the ones that Lavan has agreed to, and Lavan removes those and has his sons hide them. Isn't Yaakov kind of one of his sons also? Apparently not. There's a real difference between how he views his daughters and sons-in-law versus his sons and property. And Lavan puts the distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Yaakov, while Yaakov is herding the rest of Lavan's flock. We understand, and then after that, Yaakov practices this kind of insider knowledge, genetic manipulation of somehow figuring out how to breed lots of dark sheep and speckled goats, and that's itself a very peculiar passage which we're not going to really explore. But we see the presence of the CEO who speaks very sympathetically, but acts in a way to totally undermine the flourishing and thriving and potential for independence of the employee. So that Yaakov will leave with nothing. And if he's going to have nothing, now that he's agreed to this term that leaves him with nothing, maybe he'll have to stay after all and continue to provide Lavan with cheap labor. Moving on, we see how this plays out in chapter 31. After Yaakov did this genetic manipulation, Lavan's sons complain, saying, Yaakov's taken all that is our father's, and from all that is our father's, he's made all his wealth. It's like, wait a second. First of all, Yaakov built all this wealth with his labor. Like, the riches of a corporation belong to the workers who made it, unless you're in a exploitative system, as we are today, and as Yaakov was then. Yaakov saw Lavan's face, and it was not toward him as in time past. It seems like Lavan has seen him as this person to exploit, as a subordinate, and now Lavan's face has changed. And we see Lavan, and Yaakov complains to his wives, your father's cheated me, changing my wages 10 times over. God wouldn't let him do me harm. Finally, they have this denouement. They meet up after Yaakov runs away. Lavan again tries to do his generous speech thing. What have you done, deceiving me, carrying off my daughters like captives of the sword? Why did you flee in secrecy and deceive me and not tell me? I would have sent you off with festival songs, timbrel and lyre. You didn't even let me kiss my sons and daughters. Oh, you've played the fool. My hand has the power to do you harm, but the God of your father told me not to. What's the point of saying that you can do violence if you're not intending to do it? What are the ways in which exploiters always subtly remind those whom they're exploiting of their ability just by having a surveillance camera in the office space? It would be a shame for anybody to get penalized or to lose their job because of something so trivial as wasting our customers' times by having a conversation at work. When Yaakov explodes and says, these 20 years I've been with you, your ewes, your rachels, and your she-goats never miscarried, nor did I feast on rams for your flock. I haven't taken a thing from your property. That I never brought you an animal torn by beasts. I made good the loss you exacted it of me. If there was any loss, you made me pay for it. Whether snatched by day or by night, the scorching heat consumed me, frost by night, sleep was a stranger to my eyes. I said, blah, 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 blah. Finally, Lavan spoke up and said to Yaakov, the daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks. All that you see is mine. Yet what can I do now about my daughters and the children they have borne? Even at this end, Lavan is not willing to relinquish control and acknowledges how he sees and how he's always seen Yaakov and the family. You have been my property to exploit. Talmud Bavli and Masechet Brachot brings a teaching. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar both said, once a person is dependent on others, kevan shenitzarech adam u'briot, their face changes like a karum. As it is stated, when vileness is exalted, rum means exalted, kirum, among the sons of men. It's a verse in Psalms. But it seems to be a play on words here, reading it as krum is vileness among the sons of men. What is krum? Rav Dimi explained there's a bird in the cities by the sea called krum. And when the sun rises, it changes several colors. In other words, when somebody rich makes another person dependent on them, they make that person's face change. They deny them the possibility of identity, of independence. And that's vile to God. Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, explains it this way. Someone who is needy of others, financially or in terms of self-esteem, will find it very difficult to pray with the community. He'll be excruciatingly aware of the gaze of others, which will induce a fatal self-consciousness in him. His prayers will then become affected, marked with theatrical expressions in order to please and impress others. His face will lose its natural color. Chameleon-like, he'll respond to the imagined expectations of others, which is a better way of capturing than I've ever seen of maybe why poor and working class Jews so often stay away from synagogues, federations, the organized Jewish community. The ways in which, in subtle ways that have their lineage back to Lavan, the community constantly reminds poor and working class Jews of their dependency, their subordinate nature, of their need to rely on handouts, and the so-called generosity of people who have hoarded their wealth in the first place. Lavan uprooted the entire thing. Pharaoh, as evil as Pharaoh was concerned with Israelite fertility. He didn't want the Israelites to become too numerous and become a fifth column. the exploitation was just a tool to control their fertility and keep their numbers, to keep them a minority. That was incredibly wicked and evil. Lavan, the enslavement was the point. Lavan's entire raison d'etre was exploiting, controlling everybody in his midst, making Yaakov not the progenitor of a household, but a tool for free labor, for his own aggrandizement, for his son's aggrandizement, treating his daughters as livestock, his grandchildren as assets. That is uprooting everything. An economy of exploitation, of treating people as assets, as cogs to enrich a small number of rich people at the beginning, is worse than Pharaoh. According to our tradition, that is a story we tell even when we dwell in the Haggadah. We say, essentially, Jeff Bezos is worse than Pharaoh. All capitalists are worse than Pharaoh. Somebody who is exploiting workers to treat them as cogs and make them tools for one person at the top's enrichment, and not as humans to be flourishing and flowering from their own labor, is worse than Pharaoh. That's uprooting it all. That is denying somebody the chance for true thriving and personhood. Shabbat Shalom.